Protestant Christianity alone provides the basic assumptions that are needed in order for modern science and the scientific method to even work. For instance, in the 16th and 17th century, this is the era when modern science and the scientific method would really take off. What happened was Protestant Christians came in and they viewed the world and the universe as rational because they recognized that a rational God has created the universe, and so that gave them not only the ability but actually the confidence to explore the world that they lived in. Secondly, there was the assumption that the universe is different from God, and this is very key because up until this point, there was really no distinction between God and the universe. And so, what would happen is there was the mindset that it was sacrilegious and even blasphemous to even come in and explore and subdue and harness certain materials in the world, because doing so, in a sense, was a violation of God Himself, since God was so immanent. There was no separation between God and the universe. He was so immanent that to tinker with God's universe would upset God. And so the Protestant Christians, using the God of the Bible, recognized that there's a fundamental distinction between God and His creation. And God is set apart. God is different from everything else. Thirdly, God Himself is the one who's given us the cultural mandate, going all the way back to the garden, to explore the earth, to subdue the earth, to use the earth. And Protestant Christians recognize that being made in God's image and other people being made in God's image, us being called to love our neighbors, we're called to not only explore the universe, but to actually harness and use the universe for the betterment of society and culture and our neighbors. And therefore, you have things like modern science, modern medicine, and eventually the scientific method. But these things originated from Christians recognizing that the universe is not something that's cut off from us. We're actually called to go in and explore it, subdue it, use it. And then lastly, if you think about the gospel itself, as the gospel advances into these pagan territories, if it wasn't for the gospel, we would still be in the worldview, the mindset of that we cannot touch the world out there because it belongs, and not only belongs, but it is God. And to do so, if we were to go and explore and test and measure, let's say, trees or water or things like that, well, of course, the assumption for many centuries was that, well, this is a part of God, and you shouldn't tinker with that because that'll offend Him. And so it was the gospel going forth, flourishing in different parts of the world, that actually gave rise and stimulus to modern science. So the scientific method is when you observe something and then you make a hypothesis about what you observe, and then you go and you test your hypothesis. Usually you test it over and over and over again until it yields a certain result. And the thing is that whenever you're doing the scientific method, you're making certain assumptions about reality that can only be justified or given a basis for or an explanation for by the God of Christianity. And the reason for this is because the scientific method presupposes or assumes the uniformity of nature, that the laws of nature, they don't change, they don't waver. And so that's what gives me the ability and the confidence to actually repeat my tests over and over and over again, and assume and know that the past is going to be like the future is going to be like the past. Now, if you're an unbeliever or an atheist, what you have to say is, and what they do say, is that the universe came about through chance and random processes over time. And if that's the case, then the universe necessarily is still in a constant state of flux. It's disorderly, it's chaotic. There's no way to really know whether or not the future is going to be like the past or the past is going to be like the future. In fact, there's really no way to even know whether or not the universe didn't start 5 minutes ago. But see, a Christian recognizes that the God of this universe is a God of order, not disorder, not of chaos. He's a God who sustains all things, who upholds all things. And we know that this God has made this universe with certain laws in them. He's made this universe with uniformity in it, which allows us to do things like the scientific method. So we use the laws of logic every time we form a sentence, every time we speak, every time we communicate with one another. Without the laws of logic, we would not be able to understand anything at all. And what's great about the laws of logic, there's three things primarily about the laws of logic. Number one, they're immaterial, which means you can't test them. You can't test them empirically. You can't taste them. You can't see them. You can't throw them into a wheelbarrow and roll them around. You can't see the laws of logic. Number two, that the laws of logic are universal, which means they're the same wherever you are in the universe. They don't change in China. They're not changing in America. Whether or not you're in Mars, wherever you go, the laws of logic remain the same and constant. Number three is that they are unchanging. Now, the thing is that these are some of God's attributes. And so, in other words, God is immaterial, God is universal, and God is unchanging. And that's because the laws of logic come from his nature. And partly what it means for us to be made in God's image is that we too use the laws of logic. But see, as an unbeliever, the unbeliever has no way to account for how it is that we have something like the laws of logic. For instance, they have to say everything came from a material existence or substance. And if that's the case, then you've already negated the first criteria for the laws of logic, which is that they are immaterial. Also, for the unbeliever, they have to say everything is in a state of change and flux, and everything's in the state of evolving. And if that's the case again, then the laws of logic are no longer unchanging or universal. Now, also the unbeliever has to say that the laws of logic are something that have been formulated, invented, stumbled upon by the human being, by his own mind. Now, if that's the case, the problem with this is that my brain, according to this view, my brain evolves at a different rate and pace than another person's. And so how is it that I'm able to use the same laws of logic that someone else is using, even though my brain is evolving at a different rate or pace than someone else's? And of course, you can't account for that. You can't explain that. And that's because the laws of logic don't originate with man. They originate in God, and God and us being made in God's image. Partly what that means is that God has created us to use these laws of logic. They're not something that we ourselves have invented or stumbled upon. They're something that we've been created with. And that's how we use the laws of logic. So science uses induction to operate. Induction is whenever you move from the particular to the general. In other words, you have 10 swans. You notice all those swans are white. Therefore, you conclude all swans are white. The problem is what happens when that 11th swan pops up, and that 11th swan happens to be gray or black. And what that does is, of course, it refutes everything you've just concluded. And this, in a sense, is why a lot of the results that you see, quote-unquote, science make, you'll hear science, so quote-unquote, again, science will say this, but then later on they come back and they say, okay, actually we realize it's now this. And that's part of the problem of induction. So the law of correspondence is the idea that what is out there in the universe corresponds to my mind, and my mind corresponds to what's out there. Even though there's a difference between me, my mind, and the world outside of me, there's still a correspondence, a relationship between us. Now, this can only be accounted for by the God of Christianity. For instance, the unbeliever cannot ever say for sure whether or not the universe really started 5 minutes ago or 10 minutes ago, and he just thinks it's always been here, or for instance, he can't ever be certain that he's really not hooked up to some electrodes or some kind of brain in a vat thing where he's actually in Dallas, Texas, or in China, and what he thinks is real is actually just being projected into his mind by some kind of laboratory guy in one of these places. And so the unbeliever not being able to account for whether or not his senses truly are valid, or whether knowledge is even valid. You see, because if I don't know whether or not I'm in a brain in a vat, then I can't ever say for certain whether anything is certain. I can't ever have a certainty about anything. I can never have true knowledge about anything. And of course, this is problematic when you're talking about things like science, because science presupposes that the universe outside of me corresponds to my senses and my mind. But if I can't say that for certain, then I can never be certain about any kind of results that the scientific method or my experiments even yield. And therefore, only the Christian God can account for how it is that there's something called the law of correspondence, because we know the Christian God is a God, again, he's a God of order. He's not a God who's out to trick us or deceive us. The way that he has made us is when he creates us and puts us into this universe, we're able to operate in it because it's something that comes from him. It's his own design. And the unbeliever can't say that. The unbeliever can never say that, because the mind is constantly evolving according to them. Now, that's not to say that the mind doesn't evolve, but what's going on here is that according to the unbeliever, the mind in the process of evolving can't ever be certain that it has true knowledge of what's outside of himself because of this process of evolution. And in fact, Darwin himself said something along that lines when he was questioning whether or not, he can trust something that evolved from the brain of a monkey. And so that's why you have a real problem when it comes to this great topic called the Law of Correspondance. The reason why this is so important is not necessarily to talk about science or the laws of logic or anything like that with the unbeliever, although these topics are important. See, what we're trying to do here is establish the fact that only Christianity can account for things like modern science, for the scientific method, for numerical law, which we didn't even touch on, the law of correspondence, morality, dignity of life, beauty, things like this. And the unbeliever, the atheist, the agnostic, they can't account for how these things are so. And so what we're doing as Christians is we're trying to expose the unbeliever's inconsistencies. So he lives as though the modern science does work. He lives as though the scientific method is valid. He lives as though numerical law is valid. He lives as though there's such a thing called morality and dignity of life and things like that. But the problem is he has no way to account for that, no basis for how he can explain how that is. He can't get to the fundamental, the root of it, the presuppositions of it without becoming inconsistent. And so as Christians, what we want to do is we want to press that inconsistency to show them, to expose to themselves the fact that they are living in a schizophrenic universe, in the sense that they say one thing with their lips as far as, well, I don't believe in God, and everything's chaotic and everything came from chance and time, or chance and random processes over time. But at the same time, I want to hold to things that are very much uniform and consistent, and that they have order in it, like numerical law or like the scientific method. And so we want to challenge that. We want to press the unbeliever about their views. And in turn, by God's grace, they'll realize that Christianity alone can account for all of these things. In other words, Christianity alone can account for how you have numerical law, mathematics, how you have the scientific method, how you have modern science, morality, all these things. And of course, this in itself is not the gospel, but it is a way to assist, to give the unbeliever a reason. One of the reasons why an unbeliever would cry out, Lord, have mercy on me, I'm a sinful person, is because they start realizing that the way I'm living has been sinful in my mind. It's not just about morality in the sense of what you do with your body, smoking cigarettes, going to the bar, committing adultery, things like that. But it's the fact that they've been sinning against God in their minds because they've been rejecting the God of the universe who gives validity to all of these topics, like numerical law, like scientific method, etc. And so by God's grace, the unbeliever will see this. So this in itself is not the gospel, but this is definitely part of it, in the sense of exposing the unbelievers' inconsistencies in their rebellion against God in their minds and in the way they're thinking. So I hope this is helpful, and God bless.